I think that's a really tough question because most academics view gentrification as almost always a bad thing, because the assumption is, the dominant assumption is that gentrification, which of course means the in-movement of the middle class or the upper middle class into an area, and the housing, the transformation of area, that this almost always means the displacement of an existing lower income or working class population. So a lot of academics say, look, this is a form of social cleansing. Gentrification means the replacement of the poor by the rich, so it's a bad thing. But I think there are examples where that's not necessarily the case at all. I think if you're looking at an area which previously have maybe not had any housing there at all, then you can't have an existing population which have been displaced, not in any direct sense. So it's almost impossible, I think, to say that people were pushed out of their homes as a result of middle classes coming in. You've also got the situation, I think, in a number of North American cities where they've had large-scale middle-class flight to the suburbs, and where the inner cities have subsequently really become deteriorated and very run down. And basically you've got only the low-income groups living in those areas, and possibly very high levels of vacant property, urban dereliction, that a lot of the city governments in those cities would absolutely welcome gentrification. They would see gentrification as a partial solution to their problems, because the middle classes would come in, they would occupy housing, they would increase the tax base, etc. So there are circumstances where I think gentrification can be almost unequivocally positive and beneficial. But quite often what it can lead to is a form of indirect displacement, that over time lower income groups do get squeezed out. So it's possible, I think, that governments could try to control the scale, the extent or the pace of gentrification, or indeed even perhaps in a Singaporean case, could set limits to it and say, well, we're only going to allow a certain percentage of the housing stock to change from lower income to high income, and after that, that's finished, and that level could be set by government. So I think it's possible to balance, but I think as a phenomenon, it can have clear costs, but it can have some benefits as well. And of course, the same would apply to things like commercial gentrification. I was talking just about residential. I think completely planned cities are really rather problematic. Cities, like the kind of cities we had in Eastern Europe or Russia, where you simply have a planned economy, don't really provide the kind of housing that people want. And a market can be enormously beneficial. What's important, I think, is that either the operation of markets are constrained or limited by government, and you can set limits and say that markets can do certain things but not others, or what you do is say, well, we'll have a market solution, but we're going to actually introduce some form of government subsidy into the process. So we're going to have a certain amount of government provided housing or government subsidizing housing. And I get the impression that certainly in Singapore, that the relationship between the state and the market is one which is quite different from many, many other cities. So that in Singaporean context, the government has taken a much more dominant position, and that the private market is in a much more, the private sector is in a much more subservient position. It has a minority stake in the city. Singapore's not completely alone in that. I mean, in the Netherlands, government planning is enormously important. The government basically sets the rules and says this is going to happen in these areas, we can have development in these areas, and they then allow the private market to come in and operate. The same is true in Helsinki, in Finland, where basically the government owns 70 or 80% of the land. So to all intents and purposes there, the government calls the shots. So the relationship can be and should be a very positive one, but government can have a dominant role in it, and that's not a bad thing. That really is it's a unique question. I've never heard this question asked before. Generally speaking, gentrification is probably seen to involve, or classically, three key elements. One is an element of class change, social class change, by which we could say an income change. A working class population is replaced by a middle class, or a lower income by a higher income. So that would be an absolutely key element, I think, either occupational class or income, and you could measure that. The second element, traditionally, is that there's a major improvement in housing quality, in that poorer scale, maybe rundown housing with poor bathrooms, poor kitchens, is improved, upgraded, so you could have an element of housing improvement. The third element is probably in terms of housing cost. I think gentrification almost invariably is associated with a rise in housing costs, whether it's for home ownership prices or rental costs. There's possibly one other element, which is actually in terms of physical improvement of the environment. You could say that, but that's possibly more subjective. However, when you're dealing with something like what's termed new build gentrification, where old housing is cleared away and replaced with possibly new apartment buildings, or even new apartment buildings on what was previously derelict land, or even in a Singaporean case, land which has been reclaimed from the sea, then some of the transformational elements don't really work. Also, there's one other thing which traditionally has been seen as an key element of gentrification, and that's been a transformation from renting to owning. But I think, again, that doesn't really work in a Singaporean context. So the notion of a universal measure for gentrification, actually, I think is really rather problematic. I think probably there is a key occupational and income element, but the other elements about the housing type and housing tenure are very much nationally specific. There's probably one further thing I could add, which is a demographic aspect, and that might be something that could be injected. But generally, the notion of a single universal measure is probably a pipe dream. I think almost all cities are unequal to some extent, or in some way, or in some dimensions. I can give you the first and the most important dimension is between rich and poor. Some people have much more money than others. Some people have much more assets than others. Some people have jobs which pay much more than others. And this is the fundamental dimension of inequality. The second dimension, well, one is income, one is wealth. The second or the third dimension is probably in terms of property ownership, between people who own and people who rent. Then you've got a dimension of inequality between size of property. So if you're occupying or sharing a single room, you're in a very unequal position to somebody who's got a 300 or 400 square meter mansion, or even larger mansion, or even has several homes. So there's an inequality in terms of property size and property quality. You've then got all of the inequalities in terms of facility provision, access to public transport, access to good education, access to shopping facilities. And if you're lucky enough to live very close to a very nice major shopping centre, which is relatively affordable, then you're in a beneficial position. And if you're living miles out in the middle of nowhere, then you've got all kinds of problems of transport costs, of accessibility. So inequality takes many, many different forms and different dimensions. Oh, and I've also forgotten, these inequalities are often linked to inequalities or differences of gender and also of race or ethnicity. So in American cities, for example, there are fundamental inequalities between whites and blacks and Hispanics. And this is true of European cities. You've got a lot of minority ethnic groups, and they're often, but not always, in a more disadvantaged position. So all cities are unequal to some extent and in different ways. And even the former socialist cities were unequal in different ways. But we've probably seen an increase in inequality in the last 10 years or so. I think that gentrification and the decline of affordable housing has created a sense of dislocation for parts of the traditional working class, but quite a lot of the traditional working class has actually disappeared through a long-term process of industrial and occupational change, because most of the older Western cities like London, New York, Paris all had a large manufacturing sector. And this is also true in Southeast Asia. I mean, Hong Kong had a large manufacturing sector. What's disappeared over the last 30 to 40 years, or shrunk, these manufacturing sectors have really shriveled away. And as they have shrunk, so the traditional working class has actually begun to shrink, to disappear. Now, they have been replaced by, shall we say, a newer working class, often immigrant, maybe working in the service sector, etc. And they have been replaced to some extent by a new and growing, what we would term white-collar middle class. The more highly educated, the university educated middle class in better jobs. And I think this process of change, which has been going on maybe for 40 or 50 years, has produced a feeling of dislocation, maybe to some extent of being left behind or being squeezed out of the city to which they grew up in. And I suspect that to some extent it's had political consequences. But one of the interesting things, you ask about Brexit, the percentage of the population voting for Brexit in London was actually only about 40% or 35%, and about 60 or 65% of the population of London, which is much more multicultural, multi-ethnic, actually were in favour of staying in the European Union. So this may be a reflection actually of the ethnic diversity of London, in that the parts of Britain which did vote strongly Brexit are actually those parts of Britain with a larger, more traditional working class. That's disappeared to quite an extent in London. So I don't think this sense of dislocation had any impact on the Brexit vote directly. I think the countries which have done well at developing affordable housing are basically these social democratic democracies, particularly historically the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, also the Netherlands, also traditionally Germany, France and Britain. And of course I think that in a Southeast Asian context, Hong Kong has been quite successful at developing some affordable housing, but the big success story, I would say, is Singapore, because you have 80% of the population living in what it's termed public housing, but I think public housing is it's not public housing as is understood in the rest of the world. This is publicly provided, publicly assisted or subsidized home ownership. And to that extent, that you have provided a home ownership model for 80% of the population, Singapore has achieved something which almost no other country in the world has managed to achieve. So I'm not sure that you should be looking for lessons from elsewhere. I think probably we should be looking for lessons as to how we could replicate the success of what Singapore has managed to do.